And so, the ultimate countdown begins. My top 10 favourite vehicles in the world for 2018. And this is a car which initially I was thinking about putting even higher, to be honest, on the list. This is, well, as the list suggests, my favourite electric car in the world. It's the highest electric vehicle of any kind to feature on this list. As much as I love the Tesla, or in the motorbike world, the Agility Saetta, or a number of others too, this one really does take the cake for me. I think that this is an excellent car in pretty much every way that you'd want an electric car to be. I also, of course, love the Mercedes SLS electric drive, but this one goes even further than the Mercedes does, which isn't surprising. It's a newer car. It's much more focused from a production standpoint on being an electric car. Whereas with the Mercedes, it's an electric concept of an existing piston engine model, all that kind of stuff. Now this one is one of the fastest electric cars in the world, the Rimac Concept 1. And of course recently they showed the Concept 2. But I gotta say, I'm not a fan of the way that one looks. And as you can see from many of the vehicles on my countdown, and as I've said before, the looks of a vehicle do matter a lot, of course. For most people they would. So the fact that this one to me is a simpler, prettier, sleeker design than the new one, plus when I look at the new car, the Concept 2, to me it doesn't really look like a Rimac anymore. They're kind of a young company, I know, to have their own design style, but still it looks a bit generic to me. Whereas this one, if you actually think about it, doesn't really look like anything else on the road. It's a pretty unique looking car, while simultaneously being quite simple. The styling is relatively smooth and devoid of a huge amount of, say, intakes or wings all over the place, which is a refreshing change these days in the supercar world. Now the pricing on this car, for those who are unfamiliar with the spec side of things, when it comes to the Rimac, it's impressive in terms of spec, but the price is huge. They only built 8 of these, so it has a similar production run to the Mercedes SLS electric drive, but the price is huge. It's roughly the same as the Porsche 918, the McLaren P1, around £1 million after taxes, like 880 grand base. So it's an extremely expensive car, as most supercars or even hypercars of this caliber are these days. But what you get from that is pretty impressive. You've got 4 independent wheel controlling electric motors, putting out in total over 1,070 horsepower, 1,180 pound-feet of torque, and it does actually have, relatively rarely for an electric car, a form of transmission. It's not entirely direct drive. You've got 2 very small gearboxes, in effect, in the back end of the car, with a 2-speed option so that you can launch the car up to 100 miles per hour for best acceleration and then drop it into a much longer gear for all of the rest of its performance. Although for around town driving, Rimac apparently encourages you to just use that longer ratio because it's more efficient. Now this car can do about 200 miles to the battery fully charged, which is pretty impressive for such a powerful car. That's not far off a Tesla, actually, and this is a considerably quicker vehicle. And in a world where most electric cars, be it the SLS or a Tesla or a variety of others, they tend to be restricted to about 130 or 150 miles per hour, with very few exceptions, this one isn't even in the same league. This is a 221 mile per hour car which can hit 60 in 2.6 seconds. Now it's not lightweight, it does weigh less than something like a Tesla, which you'd hope it would, but it's still not a super lightweight vehicle. It's a 2-seater, of course, and that brings me to the main reason why I decided to drop it to 10th place. Because although this is probably the case with quite a few of the cars on this list, much more so than any of the bikes for obvious reasons, this is a car which, as much as I love it, I would never be able to experience. Because if you're over 5'10", you can't fit in the car properly. Now that's a problem with a lot of, say, homologation specials, like the CLK GTR or the 911 GT1, probably the Elise GT1, at least, if not more so. And as I said, probably a number of the cars on my favourites list would also have that issue. I should imagine a Helmet TX is probably quite cramped for someone my height. But the fact that if you are over 5'10", You're going to struggle. If you're over 6 foot, you're going to be almost doubled over. Well, not a chance. I'm a good half a foot taller than the 5'10" minimum, so this isn't an option for me to ever be able to drive it, and that's a shame. It would have definitely scored higher for me if that were an option. Not that it would really matter. I probably wouldn't ever get the chance to drive one, but even if that were the case. Now, apart from that, I do still love the car, and of course I can still experience it in certain games like Drive Club, and it's a great car in that game. It's a vehicle which is actually one of the fastest cars on offer, and in a game which has stuff like the Venom GT and the Koenigsegg 1-1 featured in the lineup, to be able to say that this is still one of the fastest cars in the game, that's a pretty big deal. Now, the performance on the car, as I already said, is definitely more than enough to take on stuff like the McLaren, the Ferrari, the Porsche, but in terms of some of its, well, tendencies for driving, it's not a great car, apparently. According to Evo magazine, the brakes lack a little bit of feel. It's got a 3-stage system, and the car itself is very clever when it comes to its tech, especially given that the company is still relatively small. They do most of their work working with other companies rather than producing tons of their own cars. And of course, Tajima, who are featured in Gran Turismo 6 with the Pikes Peak E-Runner, they have worked with Rimac with the newer version of the E-Runner, which is, I believe, the most powerful Pikes Peak car ever, or at least non-truck Pikes Peak cars, because obviously they've got massive power and torque, and one of those might have been even more powerful with those huge diesel engines. But in terms of a conventional race car, or rally car more specifically, I believe the Rimac is the most powerful. It's got something like 1670 horsepower or something like that. It might have even been more. So in terms of performance, it's an incredible car. And I also love the fact that in a similar way to companies like the Caparo T1 or the Zenvo ST1, but to a better degree than them, they managed to actually make this a reality. Now, of course, the Zenvo has its issues with catching fire, as did the Caparo, famously, and the Caparo is fairly difficult to drive on the road. This one doesn't really have those issues to the same degree. It has some issues, or at least it did when it was first being road tested, but for the most part, it's a very well put together car, and Rimac as a manufacturing company actually have quite a number of patents on their technology, some of which directly involve this car. It's got torque vectoring to all 4 wheels in a much more advanced way than most other cars that feature that system, and although it has stuff like a lack of brake feel or a lack of sound, which for a lot of people is not a good thing in a supercar, and of course I love the sound of a good supercar, but still, electric cars do have a certain appeal to me. The lack of noise can be kind of eerie, especially when it's as fast as this one is, because all you've got is the sound of the tyres and the wind, which in itself could sound pretty cool, especially at 221 miles per hour. But ultimately, it's held back by a couple of little things for me, but overall, it's an incredible example of what an electric car can be capable of, and it is definitely one which, for me, deserves a place in my top 10. I just wish I could put it even higher, maybe 6th or 7th even. But that's it for this pick. Of course, I'll see you guys tomorrow for another installment, and you can check out all of the previous episodes by clicking through at the end. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.